Comrades, I ask you to confront a truth that the ruling class hopes you never discover. The chains that bind you are not only fastened around your wrists, they are fastened inside your mind. Before any revolution erupts in the streets, it erupts in consciousness. Before the worker stands up against exploitation, the worker must first awaken to it. And before society transforms, the individual must recognize that the world they are told is natural is, in fact, an elaborate construction serving the interests of capital. Look around you. Every institution that claims to uphold order, prosperity, and progress is built on the quiet extraction of your labor, your time, your health, your very life force. Capitalism does not merely exploit your work, it colonizes your understanding of what is possible. It teaches you to see inequality as inevitability, poverty as a personal failure, and the wealth of the bourgeoisie as the product of merit rather than the robbery it truly is. For centuries, the ruling classes have relied on one weapon more powerful than armies, more enduring than laws: the workers' belief that the present order cannot be changed. That belief is the fortress that protects capital. That belief is the prison that traps labor. And that belief is the first structure we must dismantle. Comrades, recognize the world for what it is: a battlefield of classes locked in conflict, each struggling over the control of labor, resources, and the future itself. There is nothing neutral about the economy. There is nothing natural about exploitation. There is nothing eternal about the power of the bourgeoisie. Every factory, every office, every field of production cries out with the truth that the wealth accumulated by the few is created by the many by you. Yet the system would rather you never reach this understanding. It trains you to internalize defeat, to imagine yourself powerless, to accept the daily indignities of exploitation as though they were the weather unchangeable, unquestionable. It tells you that resistance is futile, that unity is dangerous, that solidarity is unrealistic. But these are not truths. They are ideological weapons designed to fracture the working class and protect the machinery of capital. The greatest threat to capitalism is a worker who thinks critically, organizes collectively, and understands their historic role in shaping society. That is why the revolution begins in the mind. When you begin to question how wealth is produced, who controls it, why inequality persists, and who benefits from your labor, you are already taking the first step toward liberation. When you see exploitation not as an isolated experience but as the structural logic of capitalism, you awaken to the truth that your suffering is shared and therefore your power is shared as well. But consciousness is not enough. The ruling class maintains its power not only through ideas but through the material conditions it imposes on you. The workday is extended, wages are depressed, communities are fragmented, all to keep workers exhausted, isolated, and suspicious of one another. This fragmentation is no accident. Capitalism thrives by dividing those whose unity could overthrow it. This is why I say, free your mind, yes, but not for the sake of abstract enlightenment. Free your mind so you may see one another, so you may recognize your comrades not as competitors or strangers, but as partners in a shared historical struggle. No worker is alone, no worker is powerless. The moment workers understand their collective strength, the very foundations of exploitation begin to tremble. Comrades, the bourgeoisie has always feared the organized worker, not because you are individually mighty, but because when united, you expose the central contradiction of this system. Those who produce everything possess nothing, and those who produce nothing possess everything. This imbalance is not only unjust, it is unsustainable. It demands transformation. Do not let the ruling class convince you that revolution is chaos. The true chaos is the world you live in now, a world where the few prosper while the many toil, a world shaped by alienation, insecurity, and the commodification of human life. Revolution is not destruction. Revolution is reclamation, the reclaiming of dignity, time, labor, community, and humanity itself. But every revolution of matter begins with a revolution of thought. Every uprising begins with consciousness. Every transformation begins when the worker declares, "I will no longer think with the mind they constructed for me." So I call on you today not simply to resist, but to awaken. Not simply to protest, but to organize. Not simply to endure exploitation, but to understand its roots and uproot them. The future belongs not to those who rule today, but to those who dare to imagine a world beyond exploitation and fight together to build it. Revolution begins in the mind. Free yourself first, then free the world. Revolution begins with breaking the ideological chains imposed by capitalism, because the first terrain of struggle is not the factory floor or the city streets, but the minds of those who labor under a system that convinces them their own. Exploitation is natural, necessary, and even virtuous. Capitalism's greatest victory is not merely the extraction of surplus value, but its ability to shape consciousness so thoroughly that workers often defend the very structures that subjugate them, believing that inequality is a fact of life, competition is human nature, and poverty is the fault of the poor. These beliefs are not spontaneous conclusions reached by the masses, but carefully crafted ideological products reproduced through schools, media, religion, and everyday social interactions, all designed to obscure the real relations of power. To break these chains is to uncover how every dominant idea in society serves the dominant class, how every story about success hides the reality of exploitation, and how every narrative of individual responsibility is a smokescreen for systemic plunder. The worker is taught from childhood that authority must not be questioned, that the capitalist deserves their wealth because of initiative or intelligence, and that the worker's role is to obey, not to analyze, not to challenge, not to imagine alternatives. In this way, capitalism does not simply exploit labor, it colonizes imagination, restricting the worker's ability to envision a world beyond wage slavery. The chain is mental long before it becomes material, because as long as the worker believes the system is unchangeable, the system remains secure regardless of its cruelty. This is why ideological liberation is crucial. Without it, even the greatest injustices appear as unalterable facts rather than human-made conditions constructed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Once the worker begins to question why they labor endlessly while reaping only a fraction of the value they produce, once they ask why a minority controls the wealth created by the majority, once they see that poverty persists, not due to scarcity but due to the deliberate misdistribution of resources, the first cracks appear in the walls of the mental prison capitalism has built around them. Breaking ideological chains requires recognizing that the narratives of meritocracy and individualism are tools of domination, not truths of human nature. It means understanding that capitalism masks exploitation behind the illusion of freedom, telling workers they are free to sell their labor while concealing the fact that survival itself forces them into subordination. It means seeing how capitalism transforms human relationships into transactions, turning solidarity into competition and community into markets. It means realizing that capitalism's stability depends on workers believing they have no alternative, that history has ended, that no system could ever replace the one that immiserates them daily. Once this illusion dissolves, the worker begins to comprehend their own role in the machinery of production, recognizing that without their labor nothing functions, nothing moves, nothing generates profit. This recognition destroys the myth of capitalist omnipotence, revealing the vulnerability of a ruling class entirely dependent on the very people it seeks to manipulate. The moment workers grasp this, even dimly, their consciousness shifts from resignation to possibility. They see that their suffering is not private but collective, not accidental but systemic, not temporary but structural. They begin to understand that true change cannot come from individual struggle within capitalism, but from collective struggle against capitalism. They see that the power of the ruling class lies not in its wealth, but in the consent of those it exploits, and that withdrawing this consent is the first revolutionary act. As ideological chains fall away, workers recognize themselves as a class with common interests and a shared enemy, capable of shaping history rather than merely enduring it. They see that liberation begins with refusing to think through the framework capitalism provides, and begins anew with the creation of a consciousness grounded in solidarity, critique, and the recognition of their own historic mission as the force capable of transforming society from one of exploitation to one of equality, cooperation, and human dignity. Class consciousness is the first weapon of the working class because without the awareness of who they are, what forces shape their oppression, and how their collective power functions, workers remain scattered individuals rather than a unified historical force capable of transforming society. The ruling class has always understood that its strongest defense is the ignorance of the exploited, for as long as workers see themselves as isolated beings struggling against personal misfortune rather than as members of a class exploited through a shared economic structure, they lack the clarity that fuels resistance. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize that their daily hardships are not isolated events, but symptoms of a larger system designed to extract their labor while denying them control over the conditions of their lives. It is the realization that the economic order is not neutral but structured to benefit those who own the means of production while imposing insecurity, competition, and poverty on those who must sell their labor to survive. This awakening shatters the illusions that capitalism works for everyone, that effort alone guarantees success, and that inequality is a natural expression of talent or ambition. Class consciousness allows the worker to see through the ideological fog that capitalism spreads to maintain its rule. It clarifies that unemployment is not a personal failure, but a deliberate feature of the system to keep wages low. It reveals that rising productivity accompanied by stagnant wages is not an accident but a calculated mechanism to intensify exploitation. It exposes the fact that while workers labor harder, longer, and under greater pressure, the wealth produced by their sweat flows upward into the hands of those who never lift a finger in production. This understanding transforms frustration into insight and despair into awareness. For when workers realize that their suffering is socially constructed rather than inevitable, they begin to grasp their potential as agents of historical change. Class consciousness also dismantles the divisions that capitalism cultivates among workers. The system relies on fragmentation, ethnic, religious, regional, occupational, to prevent the exploited from uniting against their true oppressor. When class consciousness takes root, these artificial barriers begin to crumble. Workers see that regardless of their particular differences, they share the same fundamental relationship to the means of production and therefore share the same interests. This unity does not erase diversity but elevates it within the broader understanding that the struggle is ultimately between those who labor and those who profit from labor. Such awareness replaces mistrust with solidarity, competition with cooperation, and isolation with collective strength. As class consciousness deepens, workers begin to understand not only their exploitation but their power. They recognize that every factory, port, warehouse, hospital, and office rests upon their labor. Without them, production halts, transportation stops, services collapse, and profit evaporates. This recognition is profoundly revolutionary because it overturns the capitalist narrative that portrays the ruling class as indispensable. In reality, it is the working class that sustains society, and class consciousness makes this truth undeniable. When workers internalize their essential role, they no longer see themselves as passive recipients of orders, but as the living force upon which the entire system depends. Class consciousness is the first weapon because it transforms the worker's mind from a site of capitalist domination into a site of resistance. It equips the oppressed with the intellectual tools necessary to understand their historical situation, interpret their exploitation, and envision a path toward liberation. It illuminates the structural nature of their suffering and exposes the contradictions that make capitalism unstable and ultimately unsustainable. Most importantly, it awakens the possibility of collective action. Without class consciousness, revolts remain spontaneous, fragmented, easily suppressed. With it, resistance becomes strategic, organized, and purposeful, aiming not merely at temporary relief but at the abolition of the conditions that produce exploitation itself. Class consciousness arms the working class with clarity, unity, and purpose. It turns discontent into determination, powerlessness into power, and scattered individuals into a conscious class capable of reshaping society. It is the first weapon because all other weapons, organization, solidarity, strikes, political action become effective only when guided by this awareness. Without class consciousness, workers fight blindly. With it, They fight with the understanding that they are not battling isolated injustices, but the entire system that generates them. Only through this awakening can the working class assume its role as the force capable of ending exploitation and creating a world grounded in equality, cooperation, and human freedom. Capitalism survives by dividing workers and suppressing unity because its very structure depends on preventing the working class from realizing its collective power and shared oppression. The ruling class knows that if workers ever recognize themselves as a unified force capable of coordinating their labor, their demands, and their resistance, the entire foundation of capitalist domination would crumble. Thus, division is not an accident or a social flaw, but a deliberate mechanism woven into the fabric of capitalist society. The system thrives by turning worker against worker, making them compete for wages, for promotions, for survival itself, obscuring the truth that their real struggle is not with each other, but with the class that profits from their fragmentation. The more divided the workers remain, the more secure the capitalist remains, extracting wealth while the exploited are too busy fighting among themselves to confront the root of their suffering. Capitalism fractures workers along every possible line: ethnicity, nationality, language, religion, gender, skill level, job category, and region, using these differences to prevent class consciousness from emerging. Instead of recognizing their shared position as laborers robbed of control over production, workers are encouraged to see one another as threats or competitors. Migrant workers are blamed for lowering wages, even though it is the capitalist who sets wages to maximize profit. Skilled workers are led to believe they are superior to unskilled workers, even though both remain dependent on wages and vulnerable to exploitation. Workers from different regions are taught to distrust each other, to believe that their interests are incompatible, even though both groups suffer under the same system of extraction. These divisions are not spontaneous, they are strategic. They ensure that the energy that should be directed upward toward the capitalists who benefit from exploitation is instead scattered sideways, wasted in conflicts that produce no liberation. The workplace itself is structured to deepen these divisions. Workers are placed in hierarchical arrangements, where some supervise others, not to improve production but to sow mistrust and fear. Wages vary across lines that have nothing to do with merit, but everything to do with maintaining fragmentation. The constant threat of unemployment pits the employed worker against the unemployed, even though both are victims of a system that requires a reserve army of labor to keep wages low and conditions precarious. Through these mechanisms, capitalism ensures that workers remain too insecure, too anxious, and too divided to challenge the authority of those who exploit them. Beyond the workplace, capitalist ideology reinforces division through media, education, and political discourse. Workers are told that success depends purely on individual effort, creating a mindset where the failure of others is seen as evidence of personal weakness rather than structural oppression. They are encouraged to aspire to join the ranks of the bourgeoisie, even though statistically this mobility is nearly impossible. This aspiration is itself a divisive weapon, making workers reluctant to unite with their fellow laborers because they imagine themselves as future capitalists rather than present exploited producers. Media narratives amplify differences among the working population, distracting from the systemic forces that impoverish them. Politicians, funded by capital, stir up resentment between groups of workers while leaving untouched the relations of production that generate exploitation. When workers do show signs of unity, capitalism responds with swift suppression. Attempts to organize unions are met with intimidation, propaganda, and sometimes outright violence. Workers who protest collectively face legal barriers, police confrontation, or economic retaliation. The system cannot afford widespread solidarity because unity reveals the Achilles heel of capitalism, that its power is borrowed from those who perform the labor that keeps society functioning. The more workers act together, the more clearly they see that the ruling class contributes nothing to production while extracting everything from it. Unity exposes the fact that workers collectively hold the real power to halt production, disrupt profit, and force systemic transformation. Despite these obstacles, the potential for unity always exists because the material conditions of workers, regardless of their differences, bind them together. They all experience exploitation, alienation, insecurity, and the theft of the value they generate. They all confront the same contradictions of capitalism, though the system tries to convince them otherwise. When workers begin to see beyond the artificial divisions imposed on them, when they realize that their liberation is inseparable from the liberation of every other worker, they begin to undermine the core mechanism that sustains capitalist rule. True unity becomes possible when workers understand that the barriers between them serve not their interests, but the interests of the class that extracts surplus value from their labor. As this awareness spreads, divisions weaken, solidarity strengthens, and the ruling class faces the one force it cannot withstand: a united working class discovering its collective power and refusing to be separated by the lies that capitalism depends upon for its survival. Collective organization transforms awareness into material power because consciousness alone, no matter how clear or radical, remains limited without the structures through which workers can act together, coordinate their strength, and confront the system that exploits them. Awareness is the spark, but organization is the engine that turns that spark into motion. When workers recognize their exploitation, understand their class position, and see the contradictions of capitalism, they gain intellectual clarity, but it is only through collective organization that this clarity becomes a force capable of reshaping the world. Organization channels individual anger into collective will, transforming scattered frustration into strategic resistance. Capitalism fears this transformation because once workers begin to act not as isolated individuals but as a unified body, the balance of power shifts. The system depends on workers seeing themselves as powerless. Organization reveals that their power, when combined, can halt production, challenge authority, and reshape the conditions of society. Collective organization gives structure to the awakening of class consciousness. It provides workers with the ability to analyze their situation systematically, share their experiences, and identify common struggles. Through organization, workers develop the capacity to plan, deliberate, and foresee the consequences of their actions. They learn that exploitation is not an accidental occurrence but a structural feature of capitalism, and therefore the struggle against exploitation must be structural as well. Organization becomes the method through which workers transform their abstract understanding of oppression into concrete strategies for resistance. Without organization, consciousness remains unstable, easily manipulated, and vulnerable to the pressures of everyday survival. But within an organized collective, awareness matures, deepens, and evolves into a weapon capable of challenging the entire machinery of capitalist domination. Collective organization also allows workers to overcome the divisions that capitalism deliberately creates to weaken their potential power. Within an organized space, workers see one another not as competitors, but as comrades bound by shared material interests. They come to understand that their liberation depends on solidarity, not individual assent, within a system designed to fail them. Organization makes this solidarity tangible. It allows workers to coordinate strikes, demand fair conditions, and negotiate from a position of strength. It enables them to act together in ways that no individual, no matter how determined, could ever achieve alone. Through organization, workers learn that unity is not a sentimental ideal but a practical necessity, a force multiplier that transforms what seems impossible for one into what becomes inevitable for many. The ruling class understands the transformative power of organization, which is why it works relentlessly to undermine it. Employers attempt to isolate workers, criminalize unions, and spread fear of collective action. They prefer workers who are aware but disorganized, frustrated but fragmented, conscious but inactive. A worker who understands exploitation but remains alone poses no threat to the system. A worker who organizes with others becomes a danger. The ruling class fears collective bargaining, coordinated strikes, and movements that challenge the sanctity of private property and profit. They fear the moment workers realize that their power lies not in pleading for reform, but in withdrawing their labor, disrupting production, and forcing the system to respond to their collective demands. Organization gives workers the tools to act strategically, protect each other, and build momentum that no capitalist repression can easily extinguish. Collective organization converts awareness into power by creating durable structures that persist beyond individual moments of anger or insight. It builds institutions of resistance, unions, councils, committees, assemblies through which workers can sustain their struggle across time. It ensures that the fight for liberation does not depend on isolated heroes but on shared responsibilities and collective effort. Organization embeds consciousness into practice, making resistance a daily reality rather than a temporary reaction. It transforms the working class from a passive category into an active force, capable of asserting its interests and shaping the direction of society. Ultimately, collective organization is the bridge between understanding and transformation. It takes the recognition of exploitation and turns it into coordinated action. It converts the feeling of powerlessness into the experience of shared strength. It equips workers with the means to challenge the authority of the capitalist class, not through scattered acts of defiance, but through unified, disciplined, and sustained struggle. Through organization, awareness becomes strategy, solidarity becomes strength, and the working class becomes a powerful agent of historical change, capable of dismantling exploitation and building a world rooted in equality, cooperation, and collective human flourishing. The working class holds the historic power to reshape society through unified action because it is the only class whose labor sustains every structure, every institution, and every mechanism of production on which the entire social order depends. No factory operates, no machine runs, no service functions, no wealth is created without the collective effort of workers. Yet under capitalism, this immense power is concealed beneath layers of exploitation, ideology, and division, making workers believe they are powerless even though they are the very foundation of economic life. When workers act individually, they confront the system as isolated units, easily ignored, replaced, or silenced. But when they act together, they confront the system as a unified force capable of halting production, disrupting profit, and challenging the authority of those who rely on their labor while contributing none of their own. Unified action reveals the truth that the power of the ruling class is not inherent but borrowed from the labor of those they exploit. This historic power does not emerge spontaneously. It develops from the shared material conditions that bind workers together. Regardless of differences in language, nationality, job type, or background, all workers experience exploitation in some form. The extraction of surplus value, the lack of control over the means of production, the constant insecurity that the system imposes to keep them obedient. These shared conditions create a common interest that transcends individual struggles. When workers recognize that the fight for dignity, fair wages, and humane conditions is not personal but collective, they begin to understand their role as a class whose liberation depends on unity. This recognition transforms scattered grievances into collective purpose. Unified action becomes possible not because workers are identical, but because they are equally bound by the economic structure that profits from their labor. Unified action has historically been the only force capable of compelling meaningful change. Every concession won from capital, shorter workdays, safer conditions, rights to organize, protections against exploitation was achieved not through appeals to the morality of the ruling class, but through the pressure of organized workers acting together. Capitalists grant nothing they are not forced to grant, and the only force capable of compelling them is the organized strength of the working class. This pattern repeats across history. Whenever workers unite, the ruling class is pushed back. Whenever workers are divided, the ruling class regains control. The system relies on this cycle, knowing that unity threatens its foundations. But when unity becomes sustained and conscious, it does more than secure reforms. It lays the groundwork for transforming society itself. The working class holds historic power because it produces the material basis of society. Without workers, the capitalist class cannot function for a single day. They possess capital but cannot operate the machinery, sustain production, or maintain the infrastructure that keeps society alive. Workers possess labor, which is the source of all value. This asymmetry makes unified action revolutionary because it exposes the dependence of the ruling class on those they exploit. A strike, a coordinated shutdown, a mass refusal to participate in production. These are not mere protests, but direct confrontations with the logic of capital. They demonstrate that the power of the ruling class evaporates the moment workers withdraw their labor. This realization is transformative, for it teaches workers that their strength does not lie in pleading for justice, but in exercising the collective leverage they inherently possess. Unified action becomes a historic force when workers realize that their struggle is not just against unfair conditions, but against a system that structurally depends on exploitation. The working class has the unique ability to reorganize production, redistribute wealth, and rebuild society on cooperative principles because it is the class that performs the labor necessary for society's survival. If workers can coordinate their labor under capitalism, they can just as easily coordinate it beyond capitalism. Their unity enables them to envision and construct a world where production serves human needs rather than profit, where resources are shared rather than hoarded, and where the dignity of labor replaces the domination of capital. Unified action is the pathway through which this vision becomes material reality. The ruling class fears this power because it overturns the illusion that society depends on their leadership. When workers unite, they reveal that society functions not because of capitalists, but despite them. They show that the people who build, maintain, and operate the world are capable of reorganizing it in their own interests. This is why unity is relentlessly attacked, why divisions are cultivated, and why consciousness is suppressed. The system's survival depends on workers never discovering the power they already possess. But once they do, once they act as a unified class, aware of their historic role, they become the force capable of reshaping society from the ground up, ending exploitation, and creating a world built on solidarity, equality, and collective human flourishing. Comrades, the struggle we face is not merely against wages too low, hours too long, or conditions too harsh, but against a system that lives by dividing us, blinding us, and draining the wealth we create. We have exposed the chains capitalism places upon the mind, the necessity of awakening to our true conditions, the power of class consciousness, the deliberate fragmentation imposed to keep us weak, and the transformative force that emerges when workers organize beyond the boundaries capitalism erects. Each truth leads to one unshakable conclusion. The working class is not a passive victim of history, but the force capable of rewriting it. Our power does not lie in hope alone, but in unity, in collective resistance, in the refusal to accept the world as it is. The moment we see ourselves not as isolated laborers, but as a class bound by shared oppression and shared purpose, the foundations of exploitation begin to tremble. The future will not be gifted by those who profit from our labor. It will be built by those who produce the world with their hands, their minds, and their collective strength. Let this understanding ignite a fire that no repression can extinguish. Let the awakening become organization, and let organization become action. For when the working class stands together with clear consciousness and united will, no power on earth can prevent it from creating a society worthy of human dignity, equality, and freedom.